January 26, 1945. Holtzwihr, France. 2:47 in the afternoon. The M10 tank destroyer was burning. Audie Murphy could feel the heat through the soles of his boots as he climbed onto its deck, could smell the acrid mixture of diesel fuel and scorched metal that meant the vehicle might explode at any moment. His hands found the .50 caliber machine gun, still hot from the last gunner's grip, and he swung it toward the advancing German column. 6 tanks, 250 infantry, and him, 19 years old, 5 feet 5 inches tall, 112 pounds soaking wet. The boy from Texas who'd lied about his age to enlist, who'd picked cotton for a nickel a day to feed his siblings after his father abandoned them, who'd been rejected by the Marines and the paratroopers for being too small. This boy was about to become something else entirely. The first German soldier fell at 50 yards, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession. Murphy had already given the order. His men, what remained of Company B, were falling back to the tree line, to positions they could actually defend. Standard tactics, textbook withdrawal under fire. But someone had to cover them. Someone had to stay. He'd volunteered himself. The math was simple, really. Brutal, but simple. 250 Germans advancing across open ground. 47 Americans, low on ammunition, with no armor support. The Germans had 6 Panzer Mark IVs and 2 self-propelled guns. The Americans had 1 burning tank destroyer and a forest they might reach if someone bought them time. Audie Murphy decided he was that someone. But to understand what happened in the next 57 minutes, to comprehend how one teenager on a burning vehicle could alter the course of a battle, you have to understand what came before. You have to understand the boy who climbed onto that tank. Hunt County, Texas, 1925. Audie Leon Murphy entered a world that didn't want him. The 7th of 12 children, born to sharecroppers Emmett and Josie Murphy. He arrived during the Depression's long prelude, when poverty in rural Texas wasn't a temporary condition, but a permanent state of being. His childhood home was a 3-room shack without electricity or running water. His bed was a pallet on the floor. His breakfast, when there was breakfast, was cornmeal mush or biscuits made from flour and lard. His father left when Audie was 12, simply walked away one day and never returned. His mother died of exhausting poverty and illness when he was 16. The children scattered to relatives, orphanages, anyone who would take them. Audie raised his younger siblings by hunting squirrels and rabbits in the piney woods of northeast Texas, selling them for 5 cents each. He picked cotton until his hands bled. He learned to shoot because bullets were cheaper than starvation. I killed my first rabbit when I was 5, he would later remember. Used my father's shotgun, which was nearly as big as I was. The recoil knocked me flat, but I got the rabbit. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, Audie was 16 years old, weighed 100 pounds, and stood barely over 5 feet tall. He tried to enlist immediately. The Marines rejected him for being underweight and underage. The paratroopers turned him away for the same reasons. Finally, on his 18th birthday, or what he claimed was his 18th birthday, having altered his birth certificate, the Army accepted him. He'd spent his entire childhood learning to survive. The Army was about to teach him how to kill. Southern France, August 1944. By the time Murphy reached the Alsatian Plain in winter of 1945, he'd already earned the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars and 3 Purple Hearts. He'd landed at Salerno, fought through Sicily, survived Anzio. He'd killed more men than he could count, or would count. In the Italian mountains during one engagement, he'd shot so many German soldiers advancing on his position that his rifle barrel had turned cherry red from sustained fire. His commanding officers noticed, soldiers noticed. There was something different about Murphy in combat, something that transcended his physical limitations. He possessed an almost supernatural calm under fire, could estimate range and windage instinctively, moved through battles with an economy of motion that suggested he was conserving energy for some future moment of absolute necessity. That moment came on a frozen field in Alsace. The German offensive had stalled but not stopped. American forces were stretched thin along a defensive line that included the village of Holtzwihr and the woods surrounding it. Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, held a position on the southern approach. Murphy, promoted to Second Lieutenant just weeks earlier, commanded a platoon. On the morning of January 26th, the temperature hovered just above freezing. Fog rolled across the fields in sheets. Visibility was perhaps 200 yards. The ground was a mixture of mud and ice that made movement treacherous. At 1400 hours, German artillery opened up. The barrage lasted 37 minutes. Murphy and his men pressed themselves into whatever depressions in the frozen earth they could find, covering their heads as shells shrieked overhead and exploded in geysers of mud and shrapnel. The Americans had no bunkers here, no deep foxholes, just shallow scrapes in the ground that offered more psychological comfort than actual protection. When the artillery stopped, the tanks came, 6 of them, emerging from the fog like prehistoric creatures. Panzer Mark IVs, their 75mm guns already traversing toward American positions. Behind them, barely visible through the mist, came the infantry, 250 men in field gray uniforms, advancing in a textbook combined arms assault. Murphy's radio man, Laddie Tipton, crouched beside him. "Sir, we can't hold this position." Murphy knew it was true. Company B had suffered casualties throughout the previous week. They were at roughly 60% strength. Their heaviest weapon was a single M10 tank destroyer, and it was already burning from an artillery hit, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. The crew had bailed out minutes earlier. Standard doctrine was clear: withdraw to defensible terrain, call in artillery, regroup. Murphy gave the order. Fall back to the tree line. Move in pairs. Cover each other. His men began to withdraw, using whatever cover they could find. Shell craters, the burned-out hulk of a truck, a low stone wall. The Germans were perhaps 400 yards away now and closing. Their machine guns had opened up, kicking up sprays of frozen mud. One American fell, then another. Murphy watched his men retreat, watched the Germans advance, made a calculation. Someone had to buy time. Someone had to slow the German advance long enough for Company B to establish a defensive position in the woods. Without that time, the Germans would overrun them in the open, would cut them down before they reached cover. He turned to Tipton. "Get to the woods. Call in artillery coordinates. I'm going to the tank. Sir, that vehicle's burning." "That's an order." Murphy ran toward the M10, his boots slipping on the icy ground. Flames were visible now in the engine compartment, eating through fuel lines, spreading toward the ammunition storage. Any rational person would have seen it as a death trap. Murphy saw it as a platform. He climbed onto the deck, found the .50 caliber machine gun still mounted on the turret ring. The previous gunner had abandoned it when the vehicle was hit, but the gun itself was intact. Murphy checked the ammunition belt, roughly 300 rounds remaining in the primary box, with additional ammunition cans secured nearby. Not much, but enough. He swung the gun toward the Germans and fired his first burst. The sound of a .50 caliber machine gun is unmistakable. It doesn't crack like a rifle or chatter like a lighter machine gun. It pounds, a deep, rhythmic hammering that you feel in your chest cavity. Each round is roughly 5 inches long, weighs nearly 2 ounces, and leaves the barrel at 2,900 feet per second. At close range, it can penetrate light armor. At any range, it can tear a human body apart. Murphy's first burst caught a German soldier at 50 yards. lifted him off his feet, and threw him backward. The soldiers around him dove for cover. Murphy adjusted his aim, fired again. Another German fell, then another. The mathematical equation had changed. The Germans had numerical superiority, armor support, and momentum. Murphy had elevation, a heavy machine gun, and absolute commitment to his task. He intended to kill every German soldier who tried to cross that field. The panzers began targeting him immediately. They couldn't see him clearly through the fog and smoke, but they could see the muzzle flashes. A 75mm shell exploded 10 yards from the M10, showering Murphy with frozen clods of earth. He kept firing. Another shell hit closer, close enough that the concussion slammed him against the turret ring. He kept firing. The German infantry tried to flank him, moving in squad-sized elements to his left. Murphy traversed the gun, caught them in the open, cut them down. He could see their faces now, could see their eyes widen as they realized that the single American on the burning tank had no intention of abandoning his position. Some tried to surrender. Murphy shot them anyway. There was no time for prisoners, no room for mercy. This was mathematics. Every German he killed was one less German advancing toward his men. A machine gun burst from one of the panzers stitched across the M10's hull, the rounds pinging off metal with high singing notes. One caught Murphy in the right leg, just above the knee. The impact spun him halfway around. He grabbed the gun mount to steady himself, felt hot blood running down his calf into his boot, and kept firing. Later, doctors would find shrapnel embedded in his hip and thigh, fragments from German artillery shells that had exploded near enough to wound him without his noticing. Later, he would need surgery to remove metal from his leg, would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life. But in that moment, on that burning tank, pain was simply irrelevant. The Germans kept coming. Murphy kept killing them. The psychology of close combat is not well understood by people who haven't experienced it. There's a common misconception that combat is primarily physical, that it's about strength, speed, marksmanship. These things matter, but they're not determinative. What matters more is the ability to function while experiencing absolute terror. Audie Murphy, in those 57 minutes on the tank destroyer, was experiencing sensory input that should have paralyzed him. The heat from the fire beneath him, the shock waves from nearby explosions, the impact of the bullet in his leg, the certainty, the absolute mathematical certainty that he would die on that vehicle. He functioned anyway. Military psychologists have a term for this: acute stress response maintenance. Most soldiers, when exposed to life-threatening stress, experience degradation in fine motor skills, tunnel vision, time distortion, and decision-making impairment. A small percentage don't. They experience the same physiological responses: elevated heart rate, adrenaline dump, respiratory changes, but their cognitive function remains intact. They can still aim, still think tactically, still make split-second decisions while rounds are impacting around them. Murphy was one of these rare individuals, but he was also more than that. Because beyond the ability to function under stress, he possessed something that military trainers can't teach. He possessed absolute certainty that his life mattered less than the lives of the men he was protecting. This wasn't bravery in the conventional sense. Bravery implies overcoming fear. Murphy had transcended fear entirely. He'd entered a state where personal survival was no longer part of his calculations. The only equation that mattered was time. How many more minutes he could give his men to establish their defensive position. At approximately 1,500 hours, 33 minutes after climbing onto the tank destroyer, Murphy's ammunition ran low. He'd fired nearly 800 rounds. The barrel of the .50 caliber was so hot, it had begun to glow faintly even in daylight. Dead Germans lay scattered across the field in rough semicircle around his position. Murphy would later estimate 50 men, though the actual number was impossible to verify, as German forces recovered most of their casualties. The panzers had halted their advance. Without infantry support, they were vulnerable to American artillery and whatever anti-tank weapons Company B had managed to carry into the woods. The German commander had a choice: continue the assault and risk losing his armor, or withdraw and regroup. He chose to withdraw. Murphy climbed down from the tank destroyer. His right leg buckled immediately, the wound he'd ignored for half an hour suddenly making itself known. He fell, caught himself with one hand, forced himself upright. The tank destroyer's fire had spread now. The entire engine compartment was engulfed, flames reaching 12 feet high. Ammunition began cooking off, small arms rounds popping in rapid succession. Murphy limped toward the tree line, roughly 200 yards away. Every step sent white-hot pain up his leg. German artillery, still active, began bracketing the field. A shell exploded 30 yards to his left, then one to his right. The Germans had his range now, were trying to kill him before he reached cover. He made it to the woods with approximately 90 seconds to spare before a direct hit obliterated the M10, the explosion sending the turret 20 feet into the air. What happened next would become as legendary as the fight itself, though in a different way. Laddie Tipton, his radio man, was waiting at the forest edge with a medic. They'd watched Murphy's entire stand from the tree line, had seen him hold off an armored assault with nothing but a machine gun and absolute refusal to yield. They were ready to evacuate him, to get him to a field hospital where his leg wound could be treated properly. Murphy refused. "We need to counterattack," he said. Tipton stared at him. "Sir, you're wounded. I need you to get on that radio and call in artillery coordinates. The Germans are disorganized. We hit them now. We retake the village." This was perhaps the most extraordinary moment of an already extraordinary day. Murphy, bleeding from multiple wounds, having just survived nearly an hour on a burning vehicle while holding off a force more than 5 times larger, wasn't thinking about medical attention. He was thinking tactically. The German assault had stalled. Their infantry had suffered heavy casualties. Their armor had withdrawn. This was the moment to press the advantage. He organized Company B for a counterattack while standing on one leg, directing men into assault positions, coordinating with Tipton to bring down artillery fire on German staging areas. When everything was ready, he led the assault himself, limping at the front of his men. They retook Holtzwihr by nightfall. Murphy finally accepted medical treatment approximately 6 hours after being shot. The doctors found his leg wound infected, discovered the shrapnel embedded in his hip and thigh, treated him for mild hypothermia and severe dehydration. They wanted to evacuate him to a rear area hospital. He refused, returning to his unit after 72 hours. 3 months later, in June 1945, Murphy received the Medal of Honor from General Jacob Devers in a ceremony in France. The citation described his actions at Holtzwihr in precise military language, but the words couldn't capture what had actually happened, couldn't describe the psychological transformation that occurs when a 19-year-old boy decides his life is worth less than time. But the story doesn't end there. It never ends there. Murphy's war ended in Austria in May 1945. Company B, along with the rest of the 3rd Infantry Division, pushed into the final German defensive positions. Murphy was there for all of it, accumulating wounds and medals in equal measure. By war's end, his service record listed 28 decorations: the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars with the WWII device for valor, 3 Purple Hearts, the French Croix de Guerre with Silver Star, the French Legion of Honor, and the Belgian Croix de Guerre with Palm. He was 20 years old. The Army, recognizing that Murphy's combat effectiveness was matched only by his propaganda value, sent him home as a hero. Life magazine featured him on its cover, Hollywood noticed. By 1946, Audie Murphy had signed a contract with a major studio and begun the improbable transformation from combat soldier to movie star. He appeared in 44 films over 21 years. Most were westerns. The genre suited him, allowed him to use the same skills he'd developed hunting rabbits in Texas as a child. In 1955, he starred in To Hell and Back, a film adaptation of his own autobiography. He played himself, reenacting his own wartime experiences, including the fight at Holtzwihr. It should have been absurd. A diminutive man playing dress-up in a Hollywood version of his own life. Instead, it became one of Universal Pictures' highest-grossing films of the decade, because audiences could see something in Murphy that transcended acting. They could see the truth underneath the performance, but the truth was more complicated than the film suggested. Murphy suffered from what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, though the diagnosis didn't exist during his lifetime. He experienced severe nightmares, sometimes waking up fighting invisible enemies. He kept a loaded pistol under his pillow. He developed insomnia so severe, he often stayed awake for days. He self-medicated with alcohol and, eventually, prescription sleeping pills. In 1969, after becoming addicted to Placidol, he locked himself in a hotel room for a week to withdraw from the medication without medical supervision, afraid that acknowledging his addiction publicly would damage veterans' ability to receive treatment. He spoke openly about these struggles, something virtually unprecedented for male veterans of his generation. In interviews, he acknowledged that the war had changed everything. He described killing as something that stayed with you, that accumulated like sediment layer upon layer until you couldn't remember who you'd been before. He advocated for better mental health treatment for veterans, testified before Congress, used his celebrity to draw attention to the psychological costs of combat. "People think the war is over when the fighting stops," he said in a 1968 interview. "But for some of us, it never stops. We just learn to live with it." He never truly learned. On May 28, 1971, Murphy died in a plane crash near Roanoke, Virginia. He was 46 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The funeral drew thousands of people. Veterans who'd served with him, civilians who'd never met him, but felt they knew him, families who'd lost their own soldiers and saw in Murphy a symbol of what their loved ones had endured. So what do we make of Audie Murphy? How do we understand the boy who held the line at Holtzwihr? The easy answer is to call him a hero and leave it at that. Heroes are simple. Heroes are comfortable. They confirm our belief that courage exists, that individuals can alter the course of history, that righteousness prevails. Murphy receives the Medal of Honor, becomes a movie star, rides off into the Hollywood sunset. But the real answer is more complex and more human. Murphy was a product of circumstances, childhood poverty, wartime necessity, the particular alchemy of personality and situation that creates soldiers capable of extraordinary violence. He was 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 112 pounds, not because he was naturally small, but because he'd spent his childhood malnourished. He learned to shoot, not from military training but from hunger. He developed the ability to kill efficiently because the alternative was watching his siblings starve. The war gave him a purpose. It gave him a family and company B. It gave him validation that had been absent his entire life. On that tank destroyer in Holtzwihr, Murphy wasn't just buying time for his men. He was proving that his existence mattered, that the abandoned son of a sharecropper could have value measured in the lives of others. And then the war ended, and he spent the remaining 26 years of his life trying to find another purpose, another family, another validation. Hollywood provided temporary substitute. Advocacy for veterans gave him focus. But nothing could replicate the moral clarity of that moment on the tank destroyer, when the mathematics was simple and the choice was absolute. This is what we don't talk about when we talk about heroes. We don't talk about the cost. We don't talk about the fact that the same psychological mechanisms that allowed Murphy to function on that burning tank
The ability to prioritize mission over self-preservation, to dehumanize the enemy, to maintain cognitive function while experiencing absolute terror, were mechanisms that would make peacetime existence almost unbearable. Murphy himself understood this. In his autobiography, he wrote, "I was a soldier. I was good at it. I don't know if I'm good at anything else."
January 26, 2025. 80 years after Holtzwihr, the field where Audie Murphy made his stand is now farmland. A small monument marks the location, maintained by the local municipality. Tourists occasionally visit, mostly Americans, mostly veterans or their families. The M10 tank destroyer is long gone, scrapped for metal decades ago. The Germans Murphy killed are buried in cemeteries across Alsace, their names recorded, but their individual stories lost to time. Murphy's legacy persists in ways he probably wouldn't have anticipated. His name appears in military history textbooks, on army bases, in discussions about the nature of courage. Veterans cite him when arguing for better mental health treatment. The Medal of Honor citation has been read by countless young soldiers, offering a template for what military heroism looks like. But perhaps the most important legacy is simpler than all that. It's the recognition that heroism and trauma aren't opposites. They're companions, that the same person can be extraordinarily brave and deeply damaged. That we can honor someone's courage while acknowledging their pain. Audie Murphy climbed onto a burning tank destroyer at 19 years old and decided that his life was worth less than time. He was right. His sacrifice saved his men, but he was also wrong, because his life had value beyond that moment, beyond that fight, beyond the war itself. He just never quite believed it. That's the tragedy underneath the heroism. That's what we should remember when we remember Holtzwihr. Not just the courage, though the courage was real. Not just the tactical brilliance, though the tactics were sound, but the cost, always the cost. Murphy paid it for the rest of his life, and he paid it willingly, knowing what it would cost him, because that's what heroes do. They pay the bill that others can't afford. The boy who held the line became a man who couldn't let go of that line, who spent his remaining years trying to find another position to defend, another enemy to fight, another purpose as clear as the one he'd found on a frozen field in France. He never found it. But he never stopped looking. That's not the Hollywood ending, but it's the true one.